Well, greetings everyone. My name is Brandon Kyle. I am the Director of Alumni and Family Engagement here at Pitzer College. Thank you so much for joining us for our first ever virtual Funly Weekend. We're so pleased to have you with us today as we explore and learn more about how the impact of 2020 transformed one professor's pedagogy and practices. I'm pleased to share that Professor Marcus Rodriguez will join us in sharing his experiences. But before we get started, here with us today to introduce Professor Rodriguez are two co-chairs of the Family Leadership Council, Shari Simon and Jamie Rhodes. Both Shari and Jamie individually are Pitzer parents of juniors here and have been leading our family association for the past year, which during 2020, let me tell you, was no small task. Their leadership and devotion to our Pitzer community has been invaluable, and so much of this weekend is due to their support and willingness to be flexible, innovative, and turned into keeping sort of priority over keeping connection with the Pitzer community, a high priority while experiencing being apart together. With that being said, I will now hand it over to our FLC co-chair, Jamie Rhodes. Thank you, Jamie.
Hello, thank you, Brandon, and thank you all for joining us this evening. As Brandon mentioned, my name is Jamie Rhodes, and I'm here with Shari Simon. The two of us are co-presidents of the Family Leadership Council, which is a group that leads the Family Association and works with the college to help enhance the Pitzer student experience and to foster a strong community for Pitzer families. You may or may not be aware of this, but as soon as you have a student at Pitzer College, you become a lifelong member of the Pitzer Family Association. So if this is news to you, please let me welcome you to the Family Association and welcome everyone to our first virtual family weekend.
As Jamie shared, the Pitzer Family Leadership Council is comprised of individuals who are interested in helping the Office of Alumni and Family Engagement achieve its goals. As a group, we are involved and engaged at this level because we believe so much in the value of Pitzer, the education that is offered to our students, and the type of community and values that Pitzer upholds. On Sunday, we invite all of you to join us at 10 a.m. to learn more about the myriad ways in which families, whether your students have just been accepted to the college or if your student is in the class of 21, how you can become involved and support the student experience and the college. As you all know, this past year has been difficult at many levels. Yet early in the pandemic, identifying the need to bring our students and families together, the college quickly launched Pitzer at Home, an amazing portal into what our students get to experience at Pitzer on a regular basis. This evening, we have the opportunity to hear from Professor Marcus Rodriguez, one of the professors who helped launch Pitzer at Home with a series designed to help our students and families address and accept the realities of our new pandemic normal.
Professor Rodriguez is an assistant professor of psychology and has been with Pitzer since 2018. His background includes research in the areas of global mental health, cognitive behavioral therapy, and dialectical behavioral therapy. He's also written a number of children's books about managing emotions, well-being, and the importance of diversity and inclusion. Professor Rodriguez holds a bachelor's degree from Pepperdine University, a master's from Peking University, and a PhD from Duke University. As both a clinician and academic, Professor Rodriguez brings his real-world experience into the classroom and his research, which in turn informs his practice. Please join us in welcoming Professor Marcus Rodriguez, who will speak with us this evening about how the COVID-19 pandemic changed his teaching and advising for the better.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So it's really good to be with all of you. Again, happy Chinese New Year. If you celebrate, and if you don't, I would welcome you to celebrate at some point, maybe after the pandemic. It can be pretty rowdy and fun. So yeah, I want to share a little bit about how this pandemic has and really is currently still shaping how I teach and advise. And this process has actually been really helpful for me because I hope it crystallizes some of this so that I will continue to be able to lean on these approaches to teaching and mentoring that I've gained. And a part of it came through like just the challenge and the adversity of trying to adapt to online classes in a really sudden way. But I think it has since led to like long-term and sustainable ideas. So what I have in mind is I actually would love if all of you have questions, right? Because I think that the most helpful approach to this like lecture would be if it's a dialogue. So if you have a question about the student experience, the teaching experience, advising, I can speak, I guess I can speak to my experience, and then to the degree to which that generalizes to others, then great. But I would love for this to be a dialogue. So if at any point you have a question, put it in the chat box, raise your hand, just unmute yourself and speak up. And I'd love to answer the questions that are most burning for you about what teaching is like now and what we anticipate it'll be like moving forward. So I guess I want to highlight some of the things that I've noticed have shifted for me, have changed for me during this, during the adjustment to the pandemic. I think one of them is pretty obvious, but I think it's the focus on student health and well-being, right? I'd say that seems to be general across all of my colleagues, but I guess I'll speak to myself. I think there is a very explicit focus on student well-being, and in a way that I think existed before, but now I feel very unapologetic about it. So before, I would, for example, start some of my classes with mindfulness exercises, and I would lead my students in mindfulness of anything from paying attention to their breath, trying to notice what emotions come up, trying to notice what thoughts they have. But sometimes I also, like at the start of some classes, I'll say, what is your intention for today? What do you hope to get out of this? So that you can be clear. And for some of them, like maybe what you want to get out of this is sit here, act like you're paying attention, but actually be on Facebook. And that's okay, as long as you're choosing mindfully with intention, like that's what I want to do. I kind of need to check out. So I'm going to mostly be watching YouTube while you talk, Marcus, right? But to let them make choice and come. And so that's one thing, is I lead my students in mindfulness practices, and I explicitly teach them skills that are going to help, that I guess skills that I'm using to help me manage my emotions, to help me manage my stressors. But it also, I think that's a related point, is not only do I focus on my students' well-being, on teaching them abilities, but I think also like more of a focus on my own well-being in a way that, I don't know, like the pandemic finally led me to buy a standing desk. So I have like, I don't know, like I've got this desk that can like go up and down, which I didn't used to have before. But it led me to realize, like, you know what, if you're going to be at your desk for a long time, then get a standing desk. And so yeah, just things like that. Like I've got like a little machine that makes me fizzy water, right? And so if I'm telling my students like, hey, take care of yourself, and then I'm not actually doing that, in the end, it's actually my students who suffer, because a burnt out version of myself will show up to class. And it's not the best teaching. And yet that often happens, I think, even before the pandemic. Sometimes there's just a lot of stressors that show up. And I think related to that, in another way that I focus on my students' well-being, on my own well-being, but also like a shift that I've noticed in my own field group, is that, so I as a psychologist, I practice a type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. And dialectical behavior therapy is a type of treatment for people that have really severe challenges, often like emotional regulation. And so oftentimes they get so dysregulated that they're chronically suicidal, or will do things that are really like high risk and self-harming. And so I work with a lot of clients like that. But you can imagine, like, working with really high risk clients can burn therapists out, right? They can like get exhausted really easily. And so there used to be a really high turnover in people that do this type of work in an outpatient setting, especially where you don't have a lot of eyes on your patients, but they're still high risk. And so one of the things that we do in DBT is at the beginning of each meeting, we meet once a week. We first cover, like, are there any life-threatening, like imminent life-threatening behaviors that we need to address and talk about together? But the very next thing that we do is we rate our burnout. So for example, there's like 12 people on my team, and we rate our burnout, and we say like, all right, Jamie, what is your burnout on a level of 0 to 5? Brandon, what is your burnout? 0 to 5. Amanda, Jill. And so everyone goes and they give a number. And then based on that number, if it's over a 4, then the rule is, and on my team is, well, you need to, like, even if you don't want support, you have to receive support from the team. We're going to have to like either validate you or help you problem solve it and see what we can do to bring down your burnout, so that you can be the healthiest version of you, and also so that you can take good care of your patients. And, it's that idea, like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that through the pandemic, I think it's allowed me to bring some of that spirit and some of that approach into my own field group. So like among my colleagues here in psychology, although we're not therapists and we're not technically, we're not helping suicidal students necessarily, that we triage to the appropriate sources. I'm still, in this context, I'm just a professor. I don't provide therapy to my clients. But in our meetings as a field group, we've focused more on just being really open and honest with each other. Like, I'm just, I just let my colleagues know. For example, just recently, I just said, like, I'm personally going through a tough time in my family, and just letting people know, like, hey, this is going on, so that right? So that you can either like validate me and cheerlead me, or maybe be like, hey, that extra thing that they put on you, like, let me take that. Or so that in the long run, if we, if I'm feeling strong and great, then like I can take that extra burden from one of my colleagues that's not. And that's only possible if we tell each other when we're struggling, so that then it's possible that we can support each other. And I think that's a shift. And I think it immediately directly benefits our students, or maybe indirectly, in that if we as professors can support each other in the psychology field group, then that means that we're going to individually also be like happier and healthier, and be able to provide the best kind of teaching and advising for our students. And that's a shift that, like, it didn't quite feel like that before, but I hope that that's something that will continue. I certainly plan to continue that, of just being really open and vulnerable with my colleagues about, like, here's what's going on with me. Like, I'm a real person. We're all real people. Yes, and we have our own unique challenges, and those do affect how we show up in the classroom. So I guess that's like one big shift, is just this very explicit focus on student well-being, our personal well-being, the well-being of our colleagues. And like now it's even like written into my syllabus, for example. I think another change that I've noticed has shown up in my teaching and advising is, I think there's a lot more intentional focus on community building in my classes. Because I think before, a lot of that would happen before, like at the beginning and end of class, right? Like, I might come in 5 minutes before class, there might already be some students sitting there. And as the students trickle in, they sit next to their friends, they talk, and there's conversations happening before class starts. But if you notice on Zoom, it feels kind of like awkward, right? Like, I don't know, like we had a little conversation right before the meeting started, but it also, I don't know, like people's instinct is log into the meeting, like mute yourself. And so there's that, it like Zoom does create that distance between people. And so one of the things that I've tried to do very intentionally, both because I think it helps, again, my students' wellness, but also because it builds that sense of safety within the classroom so that we can have really tough discussions. Because if people don't feel safe, it's really hard to have really uncomfortable conversations. But if we don't have uncomfortable conversations, I think we're going to probably end up having really shallow conversations, which I also don't want us to have. And so this is the dilemma. And so what I end up doing is saying, all right, so if I'm going to try to help my students to build community, then I do very intentional things. And for example, I'll start class by asking, like, what's one thing that brings you joy? Or I'll ask them, like, what was the highlight of your weekend? Just to get people talking, especially right before class starts. I remember when I was learning how to be a therapist, one of my supervisors said, if you can get again, this is in therapy, but if you can get your group members, if I'm leading a group, they say, if you can get everyone to talk within the first 5 minutes, then it's way more likely that they're going to talk later. If people don't say anything in the first 5 minutes, the likelihood that they're later going to say something gets way lower. And so I'll start class, and I almost always within the first 5 minutes try to break people off, my students off, into breakout rooms and be like, hey, talk about this, connect with each other. Because if they talk and they turn on their cameras, then they're going to keep doing that during the rest of class. So that's like another, I guess, shift that before that would have felt like, I don't know, it would have felt like fluff. It would have felt like, Marcus, you're just like trying to like waste time. Like, you didn't prepare a very good presentation, or like, you don't have enough slides today, do you, Marcus? And now it's essential. And it's essential to build community, especially because the way now that we're doing class on Zoom, that I want my actual live class to go, is that we use our class time to process our content, right? Like, to be able to learn how to, I really want my students to learn how to use the knowledge that I'm giving them. And so I want them to teach themselves, right? My expectation is, here's the readings, here's the videos, here, I want like the didactic portion, the teaching portion of class to happen before class, so that when we show up, I'm not lecturing, or if I do lecture, it's like really short lectures because people get really bored on Zoom really fast, right? And so the idea is then, all right, how can I, if I'm using community well, if I'm building community, then that system works, where I say, teach yourself, read this article, and then come together so that we can learn how to apply it, how to understand it, how to integrate it with the other things we're learning. So that's another way that my teaching has shifted, and I think that it's led to the way that students, if we really create scholars, people who are in the long run going to be able to be responsible consumers of information and producers of information, that's actually what it's going to look like in the long run. Is they're going to read things, they're going to teach themselves, right? That's what grad school is like. Like, I don't know, at least my grad school experience was, I mostly taught myself, right? And beyond undergrad, I think for most people, we need to learn how to teach ourselves. So I say, here's the articles, here's the videos, watch these, read these, and then come prepared to apply them, to critique them, to analyze them. I think another shift that I've noticed in what happens with my teaching now is I'm much more willing to take big risks, right? To do things that, like, so I don't know, for example, like now my classes, I have my students write a children's books. So like, if you notice, like I collect lots of children's books, and I usually read children's books to my students at the end of each class period. Again, also as a part of like wellness, of like, here's this idea that I just taught you about, it's abstract, and now let me bring it all to like, let me read you a children's book that I think is going to be able to depict, or is going to illustrate these points in a way that's more vivid, more memorable, more creative. And then I want you as students to do the same as your final project. I want you to try to think about, how do you take a really abstract idea or something like really, complicated from this class that you learned, and write it in a way that a 6-year-old can understand. And oh yeah, use a story to explain that idea. It gets really complicated, but I think it's actually forcing my students to wrestle, because it's really hard to explain something really simply with very few words and using story. But I think if they can do that, then they really get it. And so I think it's a risky way of teaching. I think the rewards have been great, right? I get really good feedback. My students love it, and it feels like a break for them. It's exercising a different part of their brain, which I think again leads to like well-being and like not to prevent them from getting burnt out if they're taking 4 classes and they're writing 4 term papers, during finals week. So instead now they're writing 3 term papers and a children's book. And so I think that when I take big risks with like activities that I do, discussions that I lead, like reading children's books, leading mindfulness exercises, it gives my students permission to take big risks. So for example, like, I don't know, like I have students, I just met with my students today that are going to be leading discussion on Tuesday, and they're going to do a skit. So they're going to do like an online skit to depict, it's a class on ethical issues in psychology. So they're going to act out an unethical orientation to like a consent form in a study. And I think that that's possible. The students are willing to take risks like that because I'm willing to take risks. And I think I'm more willing to take risks because it's really easy for my students to get bored in class and to check out emotionally. So I'm like, well, like that's no good when that happens. So I might as well try to do something that's gonna like get their attention. And if it fails, like, okay, like worst case scenario, I embarrassed myself. If it works, then I help to like connect my students to each other and to the ideas that I care about in this class. And that then helps me to also cultivate this culture that I want in my class, which is like a no shame and no anxiety. I think students don't learn well when they're anxious. And yet there's this weird, I don't know, there's so much anxiety, like even pre-pandemic, to be clear, like students are so anxious about their grades and they're anxious that their teachers think that they're not smart enough, and they're anxious that, you know, that they're not going to do well in the world. And I think a part of it, to be honest, I do think that like they're getting it from their at least some of their junior professors might be really anxious too. And so part of me is like, all right, first off, Marcus, like don't bring that anxiety into the classroom yourself. Like take good care of yourself so that you're not bringing that energy and inadvertently affecting your students with it. But also, I explicitly tell my students, like, this is a no shame, no anxiety zone, because if you feel a lot of anxiety, you might think that anxiety is motivating you. And you might think that, I think some students think that their professors want to see them anxious. I don't know, like this is based on my conversations. I think that there's a part of them that thinks like, if I tell my professor I'm really worried and nervous about my class, that the professor's gonna be like, oh, this kid really cares a lot. And so somehow this culture of like feeling worried, expressing worry to the professor gets perpetuated. And I'm just like, whatever that pattern is really unhealthy, I think. And it actually is not, it's to the detriment of the students. And then it leads me to feel like I need to somehow like soothe the student, which I don't want to do. Like, I just want to like, you know, like I prefer to not be like, no, it's okay. And then I'm reassuring them. And then they kind of like it when professors reassure them. So then they act more anxious. And then it creates this cycle. And it's like, no one wants that. Like, you don't want to feel anxious. And so one of the ways that I can help them not be anxious and not to be super ashamed is I say, like, if you take big risks and you make a mistake and it doesn't go well, like if the skit on Tuesday is a total flop, I told them, I said, it's okay. I said, I love that you tried it. And I know that it would have been super safe if you just pulled out a PowerPoint and wrote out different ways that are, you know, that things could go wrong while you're orienting someone to a consent form in a study. Yes, that would have been safer and easier and also way less memorable. And so I tell them, I'm like, I love that you're doing that. So if it turns out to be a total flop, I say, that's like, I'm going to give that an A, like, because you tried and it might have been epic and awesome. And so if students know that when they make a mistake, that I'm not going to jump on them, then they're actually willing to take more risks, because they're like, hey, I know that I've been encouraged to take risks. It's been modeled for me by my professor who's taking risks and how he approaches his class. And he's assured me that if I take a risk and it doesn't go well and it doesn't have the effect I intended, that he's going to like be okay with that, right? And that plays out, I don't know, it plays out a lot. Like just probably like a month and a half ago or so, one of my students is helping me, one of my research assistants is helping me with my website and updating, she was updating my website at like our lab website, and it has like my research assistants and my collaborators. And then like at midnight, she sends me a text message and says, oh my gosh, Professor Rodriguez, I deleted like the whole page. I don't know what happened. It's gone. And it was just that moment of like, no shame, no blame. If I want to create a situation where students, like, she doesn't know how to build websites, but she was still trying. If I'm going to create a culture where people are willing to be like, sure, I'll give it a shot. Like maybe and then one day she can write on her resume, I built a website and here's the link. Do you want to see? It's kind of sexy, right? If I want them to be able to have those experiences, then I have to be ready for like a 12 a.m. text where she's freaking out. And I just said, it's totally fine. We'll figure it out. Like, or worst case scenario, we have to rewrite it. That then lets students know, okay, it feels safe to do something, to try something. And in the end, when she was actually less anxious and calm and realized that like, it's okay, like it's just more time and we'll deal with it. And I guaranteed in advance that it was going to be a no shame, no blame, with the one exception of like, if you do something that's unethical, then there will be blame and there will be shame. But like, if it's a mistake and it's not like an ethical, you know, or like blunder, then yeah, I would say like, it's just like, all right, let's figure out how to fix it. And that has created, I think, a culture where people are willing to take risks. And the pandemic has forced me to take more risks in teaching. And it's been good for my teaching, but it's also been really good for my students to see. And when it doesn't go well, I'll be super honest with them. Like, yeah, I had something really different vision in my mind. Like I pictured this whole thing, this conversation was going to look different. So, yeah, those are some of the, I guess one other thing that I was thinking about that, and I guess it goes to that first point of like really focusing on my students' well-being, is I've also made myself more, available to my students. Also during this pandemic, within my own limits. Again, always observing, like, what are my limits? Like, where's my own burnout? But within that, and so what I've done is I just created this like online account on calendly.com. I don't know, it's just, I don't own any stakes, so I'm not trying to, but I think it's a great app. And so I just send a link to my students, and all of my availability between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., except on Fridays, is there. And anytime that they want, they just log in and they can just book an appointment with me, and it automatically populates on my, on my Google Calendar. And then I just look at my Google Calendar and I say, okay, great, I'm meeting with these students. And then it asks them like, what's a brief, what's our meeting about? So they don't show up totally blind. So they tell me like, here's what it's about. But that has helped to replace, the reason that I did that is because before I used to have students that would just kind of pop into my office, right? Like you would just, I don't know, I have a big window right in front of my office. So students would walk by and they'd see me and they'd wave, and they could kind of get a sense if I was busy or if they could come in, and they'd come and talk. Like that doesn't happen now. So this was like the closest equivalent, and it's worked really well. Like I have, multiple students that meet with me for 15 minutes, 30 minutes. But also, I think it's cut down on my email, because like at the beginning of the pandemic, there's so many emails for scheduling. Like, well, does this time work for you? Oh, sorry, I have class then. Oh, what about this? Oh, sorry, I'm in practice. And then like, I could meet then. I'm like, oh, sorry, I'll be teaching then, or I have therapy. And it's like 5 emails for a 15-minute meeting, Then it's like, shoot, like this was a huge waste of everyone's time. Like I was actually feeling less, they're like calling me to talk about how burnt out they are. And they're like, now I'm more burnt out, just trying to meet with you to talk about my burnout. And so using things like Calendly and making myself available to students while also doing that within my own limits, I think are some of the changes that I've made. And many of those, I think all the things that I mentioned are changes that I expect will continue well beyond this pandemic. So I could say more, but I wanted to ask and see if there's any questions first.
So you're innovating and leveraging your domain expertise, if you will, to really impact what you're doing in the classroom and to help your students and you kind of evolve to this ever-changing environment. How, if you were made, head of instruction of all, like, how would you inform someone who is leading a physics class or a differential equations class that they feel sometimes so much pressure to meet a particular timeline? Is there a way that you think they could integrate many of these practices into their classroom instruction?
I feel like I don't know enough about their teaching objectives, but I guess that would be my answer. Is I would say, can I see your teaching objective, your learning objectives for your students? And then I would ask, like, do you want to add any of the things that I've just described to an objective? Because as soon as you do, then you justify it to your students. You say like, oh, we're doing this thing. We're starting out with a mindfulness practice, or we're starting out, and it's because I have this objective, and this objective is in the service of this, of the objective of building community, and building community is an objective of really critically being able to analyze our readings. And that's in the objective of helping you learn how to learn, right? And if you can stack that, if you can show your students why the thing is important, then yeah, I don't know, like that's kind of how I think about teaching. Is I think about like, what are my teaching objectives? And a lot of times I start with teaching objectives, but if I'm completely honest, sometimes I start with like, I want to do this, right? Like, and then I'm like, what's a teaching objective that could justify doing that? Like, if I'm completely honest, I go both ways. And so sometimes someone might say like, you know what, I really want to have a space that feels like this when I'm teaching. I want that for me and I want that for my students. Maybe you start with that end outcome and you decide, all right, then what's a learning objective that could be in the service of that goal? And then what tasks could I integrate into my class in the service of the learning objective? So without knowing the specific classes, I guess that would be like I don't know if that feels too abstract.
No, that's great. I mean, and it's just a matter of thinking about whether or not the people that gravitate towards those fields think about the practice of teaching in that same way. Its relevancy becomes even more, relevancy can become even more critical in a two-dimensional world. Mm-hmm. But as you're saying, bring it back, these same practices back into hopefully our three-dimensional world. It's going to just be that much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
I have a question also, and that is, when I think about the liberal arts education, and particularly at an institution like Pitzer College, I think a lot about the Socratic method and really deep discussion. And a lot of the sort of tools that you've described are sort of getting at this from different directions. And I'm curious how effective you feel like these tools are, but also how rich the discussion has been through Zoom, and whether you think that which of these tools you think has been most effective in really drawing the students into this sort of active discussion that really drives a lot of learning.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm still figuring that out, but I'll tell you what I know now. I know that for a really good discussion, my students have to read. But if I don't test them on the reading, they don't do it. Like, I don't do reading that I don't have to do. Like, unless there's unless I'm like super intrinsically motivated, like I'm personally interested in that. But I would say like, I'm also really interested in having a good time with my friends, or, skateboarding, like all the other things. So it competes. So what I do is I actually have my students write reading notes for each article, which they hate, right? Like, I get so much, like, they're just like, oh, this is so much time and I don't like it. But I'm like, yeah, but did you read? They're like, yeah. And I'm like, awesome. Like, because it forces me to be really, really picky about what readings I assign. If I'm asking them to write notes on it, then I better make sure that I've chosen a really good article that I think is going to inspire them. Not every article will inspire every student, but I certainly want every article to inspire some students. And I want every student to be inspired at some point by some of the articles that I, are really, maybe not inspired, but like really challenged and enlightened. And so a part of it is I have to assign good readings. Another part is I have to require that they actually read them. And that means I have to make they're motivated by their GPA. So I have to tie reading to their grades, which then guarantees they read. And then I think letting them know, like, I actually give my students, I can even like share my syllabus, but I give my students really specific instructions. So this is like a syllabus for one of the classes I'm teaching right now. So I give them really specific instructions about, so if I'm telling them like about participation, right? And I'm asking them and I'm saying like, all right, like I expect you to, what is it? I'm hoping that our discussions are going to be a place for you to really facilitate deeper understanding, right? It's a way for you to confirm your knowledge, to try out your analyses and comparisons and evaluations in creative ways. And that ultimately I can say things like this, right? These are big ideas that sound kind of fluffy. And yet then I say, okay, great. So like, here is a scholar, here's two scholars that came up with different ways for how do you talk to your classmates? Right. So I have to teach them, like, if you did do the readings, that doesn't guarantee that like how to talk about the readings with your classmates. Even seniors, I think I've been surprised that a lot of them don't quite know. So I say like, all right, great. I also make a very explicit, it's even underlined. Each student, if you want to get full participation, each student has to actually contribute 3 comments per week. So I've got, it's in my file cabinet. I've got a photo roster, and each time someone says something, literally anything. So like if Linda said like, I had dumplings during Spring Festival dinner tonight, I'd be like, boom, I just put a little like stick right there. So I want them to speak 3 times in class, because I think that consistency versus intensity is the way that eventually we're going to arrive at something productive and exciting. And I also know if they're looking, you know, in a 3-hour class, if they're looking for 3 opportunities to say something, then they're going to be listening more carefully to their classmates. They're going to be thinking like, is now the time? Can I say something now? What if I said this? Right. And then, so that's a part of like how I create those conversations. But another is I actually have to, I'm very explicit. I say like, if I give a traditional lecture, it's just going to foster passivity and dependency, right? It's going to have you think that like I show up to class and I just dump knowledge into you, and then you're going to leave and have knowledge, right? Like, when in reality, I teach them, I'm like, no. So here's different ways to do class. There's a authoritarian class where like each of you in your isolated little like Zoom box, you know, and you're just a recipient of my lectures, and you just, you know, receive information, and I tell you in a directive way, and you passively sit there. And then if we do have discussions, it's monologues, right? And instead I say, I literally have to teach them how to benefit from the type of class that I want, instead of just expecting that they're going to be able to do that. And so again, like I just give them instructions around like, all right, so if you're going to have a discussion, here are some of the most helpful ways to do that, right? Like instead of trying to convince someone else, look for the right answer, right? So I guess, again, these are, it's still not super concrete. Like I understand that like even these ideas are hard to apply, but if my goal is to help my students to really think critically and reflect on their experience, then I can't just tell them. I thought before I could say like, all right, kids, like I need you to do the readings and write notes on them and come and we're going to talk. And like a few years later, I was like, you know what? Like I actually need to teach them how to do this thing that I took for granted and assumed. And some of the kids day one, first year of freshman year, know how to do that, right? And I don't know how or where they learned that, but others, and I would say most, need to be taught how to have the unique type of conversation I want to have, which is different than the kind of conversation another professor wants to have. And so it forces them to be flexible too, because sometimes like, yeah, but that's not what I do in my other da-da-da-da class. I'm like, that's cool. Like, great. Now you have 2 ways of engaging in a classroom. How exciting. Like, I'm so happy for you. So I think one part is making my expectation really explicit, my rationale for my expectation really explicit, and then giving them immediate feedback when it's not working right away. And it's like, oh yeah, you know, like just now that comment that you made, that was actually longer than I wanted. And I'm a horrible like modeler of that, but I am the professor, and my students do. My first year, so on my teaching evaluation, one of the questions that I ask my students is, what percentage of the time was the teacher talking and what percentage of the time were the students talking? And my average, like the average across all my students, came to 60% of the time students were talking, 40% I was. And some of the feedback was they didn't like that. And I got several students like really upset, like, we want to hear more from Marcus. So I adjusted that, and I hit the sweet spot last year, and the average is 50-50, and no one was saying that anymore. So I did. I'm sensitive to what they want. So some kids want that fire hose approach of just like lots of information, and I just like give them lots of information. And I know that real learning, the learning that's going to impact them the most, is when they say the thing, like what you're saying, Socratic, you know, like questioning. If I can, through discussion, lead them to make the very points that I wanted to make, and then I just have to come in at the end and just sort of clean up any points that weren't made that I had in the back of my mind that I wanted to be made. but usually I can get my students through the discussion to make 80% of the points that I wanted to make, but it's going to be so much more impactful when it comes out of their own mouth or out of the mouth of their classmate. So all of these rationale, it's super important for me to give. And I also have to be like super honest at the beginning of the class and say, if you're looking for a lecture for a professor that's just going to like bring a PowerPoint and lecture for an hour and a half, then this is not the class for you. I could, right? Like I actually have to fight the urge. As you can tell, I love talking. I fight the urge because I think that's what's best for my students. And so I tell them that.
That's great. Thank you. That's super thoughtful.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, in the last year, have you tried to adopt something that maybe didn't work? And how did you sort of pivot and learn from that?
Yeah, a lot of things. I'm trying to think. I did still provide lectures. I was like, you know what? Like, I'm a really engaging lecturer. I can do it. I can make it happen. And it's like, no. And I just had to acknowledge to students, like, I can just see that glazed look on their eyes. It's just like their faces, just like they're feeling lonely and they're feeling, yeah. And so I shifted. I think I often shift, like this meaning like during the semester, just last Thursday. So I have a class that meets on Tuesday, Thursday, and I was getting a lot of feedback that like they find the readings and the reading notes really onerous and they feel frustrated. And one of the students said, you know, I do reading notes for another class and here's how we do them. And I said, that sounds really cool. Send me the syllabus or that segment. And I looked at it and I was like, cool. Like, so I stole the idea. I was like, look, I'll now give my students two options. You can write the reading notes the way that I said, or the way that this other professor said, which I think is maybe even better than my way. So I think now I like to give students choices. So I let them choose, do they want to write a children's book and a query letter, or they want to write a term paper? Last year I gave everyone that choice and everyone chose the children's book and the query letter. But I think I give my students more choices now. And before, I think I would be like, you're going to write a children's book, or like, you're going to write a term paper. And then because if I do that, they'll be like, professor, this isn't fair. Like, no one has ever taught me how to write a children's book. And I'll be like, look, you chose to. You could write a term paper if you want. Or if they're like, I'm tired of writing term papers, like, you could write a children's book if you want. And so I think whenever I find myself making mistakes that like aren't working, and of course, like students' complaints are not really the best metric for whether or not it's working. So I do understand that just because they're complaining doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It might mean like it's making them uncomfortable. But a lot of times when they're complaining, it is because I've missed the mark somewhere. There's always a kernel of truth in what they're saying. And so then I try to pivot. I try to shift to, all right, then what other options could we put on the table? If it still meets the learning objectives that I have for you, then yeah, like I'm on board. Let's try that. Like it's dialectical, right? I the type of therapy I do is dialectical. It's like that little like Roomba, that like vacuums, and every time it bumps into something, it just backs up and pivots, and bumps into something and backs up and pivots. And I try to be like a Roomba. And so when challenges show up, I'm like, oh yeah, that didn't work, back up. And sometimes I'll back up like mid lecture and I'll be like, ooh, like this isn't happening the way I wanted. And modeling for my students, like skills like being like a Roomba, right? Being dialectical is going to be more useful to them than the actual content that I teach them. I think they're going to remember more my pivoting. They're going to remember my repairs. So another way like that when I make mistakes is I own it. Like I invited a guest lecturer. So I also have way more guest lecturers. I have people from all around the world. I have people from like Nepal and China and Singapore and Mexico. Just this semester, they're going to be teaching in my classes, like guest lecturing. That before I wouldn't have done. But last year I had a guest lecturer, and that guest lecturer said some stuff that was just like, nothing that was like explicitly homophobic or racist, but it was just, so I couldn't choose a moment to like interrupt and be like, no, but I was like, like it just didn't feel, it felt like it wasn't really depicting the values of who we are as a school, or who I want to be as a professor, at least. And so it was like a 2-session class, and I ended that early. I was like, great. I wrapped up the conversation. I was like, let's take a break. And I was like, you know what? I have something else planned for my students. And right afterwards, I just apologized to my students. Like, I was like, how did that go for you all? Like, how do you feel? And sure enough, they felt the same way. Like, they're really upset. And I was like, yeah, like that's valid. Like, I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was in the moment. And I'm glad that some of them could. But I think another thing that I'm quick to do is to apologize and to ask, how can I make a repair? And those are those Roomba moments of like a Roomba bumps into it's just that constant pivoting. I think they're going to remember how I taught, and maybe that will be useful to them regardless of what they go on to do. If they become therapists or chemists or politicians or, I don't know, whatever they do, it'll be useful, because being dialectical, making a repair when you need to, I like to model that for them. And so each time I make a mistake, I'm like, great, it's an opportunity for me to model for them apologizing, and to model what that looks like, right? Especially like I said something that really invalidated a student once, and basically, it's too long of a story to tell, but yeah, I said something that hurt the student. Felt like I was minimizing their feelings when I said something, and the damage. But I didn't hear about it until later. The student wrote me an email and told me about the effect, and so I apologized in person on Zoom. But then I also asked, like, can I also apologize in front of the class, because the damage was done in front of the class, and then I want to then repair in front of the class too. And the student later said, like, that was like so meaningful. I think this, to be super honest, I think this student was really, really sensitive, right? So I'm not saying it was completely my fault. I think it was the transaction. Like, I definitely could have been more sensitive. And I think that same comment on another student might have landed. I think they would have given me the benefit of the doubt maybe, and been like, oh, I could have heard Marcus's words in several ways, but that student heard it in a hurtful way. And that student said, like, that was like the highlight of that student's semester, of like, wow, like I really appreciated that you apologized, but that you apologized where the harm was done, and that you didn't like apologize for the effect that it had on me, right? That wasn't the apology. The apology is like, yeah, I messed up, and that's not the kind of professor I want to be. Like, I definitely want to try to like be better than that. And so I appreciate this opportunity to make a repair when I'm not.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I want to take your class.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
You're amazing.
Marcus,
Hi,
I
Linda.
wanted to comment on how you include every type of learner, and especially showing your vulnerability where some of the choices that you made didn't pan out to your favor, or the outcome was not favorable for everyone. But the fact that these are all students, and it's just another reminder of why we're all at Pitzer, where students learn differently. You talked about offering the children's book. You talked about making these skits, take them out of their comfort zone and still be resilient, because that in the long run, this is what it's all about, especially during this pandemic time. So I appreciate it. And thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Awesome.
I want to
have
hear
a question. Oh,
no, go ahead.
go ahead, Susan. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Oh, I was just going to say, I want to hear, when we are back on campus, how what you've learned, how what you talked about tonight translates back into the classroom when we are all physically together and we're not having this sort of shared global experience. So anyways, I'm just trying to book you for, like, hopefully the fall.
Yeah, I think those things, like the idea of focusing explicitly on my students' wellness and telling them that that's a priority, that's a part of a learning objective, of one of my learning objectives, and continuing to make it really explicit to them how essential that I'm not just wasting time to do community building exercises. I think a lot of times students think like, oh, you don't actually know very much about this topic. That's why you're having this, break out into small groups. And I think my own insecurity sometimes leads me to be like, no, I got to lecture and show them like, I know lots of things, I read lots of books. Like that's my own ego and my own insecurity. And I think that like what I want to take back is that confidence. Like, no, like I think time will show them that like I know the things that are essential and that I can help them to like build community so that they can be active, like in their learning, so that they can use the tools that I try to teach them, not just the content, but the ways that I want them to interact with the content, that community is essential. And I also will continue to use Calendly because it saved me probably like 15 emails every week, like fewer, maybe 20 emails less that I write a week just because of Calendly. And I think another thing that I didn't quite mention, but that I think has been helpful for me in this pandemic that I want to take back is I think also maintain, and maybe I didn't say enough about this, I still maintain boundaries with my students. Meaning like, I think sometimes my students, they know that I'm a therapist. And so I think there's a part of them that's like, oh, like I'm dealing with, I'm very clear that I don't want them to overshare and then later regret it. So I encourage them to be mindful, like, hey, like, it seems like you're like a lot's going on for you right now. I just want to make sure that like you've thought through what parts of what's going on you want to share with me, and that you don't in a moment, like having not thought about it, like sort of pour it out and then you can't take it back. But also I say that because in this context, I'm still a professor. And so what I mean by that is like, I could easily get pulled in to being the therapist for like a handful of my students, like not just one or two. And yet that would burn me out. So instead, what I can do is I can triage and I can say, that sounds really tough. And yes, I can use my clinical experiences to say, like that sounds like depression, right? And I literally last week, I told my students like, that's depression. Like, you're really depressed. And I can tell you what the course of that depression will look like if you don't make that a priority. It's like riding a bike with a flat tire and you're pedaling super hard and you're almost not going anywhere, but you're saying, no, I don't have time to pull over and change my flat tire. Like, you don't have time to not pull over. Like, and so I do that, right? And like, that's not fair because I am a clinician, right? I'm a clinical psychologist. I don't think most professors can say with certainty, like, oh, that's depression, or like, oh, that's PTSD. But then I don't like treat that. I say like, you need to you need to go to Montessor, you need to talk to a professional, or maybe you need to like whatever it is, you need to make that a priority. And I can say that because I do that in my own life, right? And I tell my students my own life experiences. Like I've been really, like about 5 years ago, I was really depressed myself, and I made it a priority. And so that those conversations about wellness and that priority, I think I want to continue to take with me. And I will, and while still maintaining boundaries. So I don't want you guys to hear that like people book, themselves on my calendar, whatever they want, and they just have like therapy sessions. I'm still their professor, and I try to do the part that I can to enhance their wellness. So those are the things that I'm going to continue to take with me. I think Rosalie had a question.
Yes, thank you. I also wanted to thank you for the extra attention to student wellness that you've been describing, for making the Zoom environment more engaging. I'm definitely going to steal some of your ideas for my own staff meetings because these are things I've heard that I wish we would be doing. But a question I have is, I've heard from my daughter that this has been the case in all of her classes where this environment has been fostered, except maybe her first chemistry class. But was this an organic effort by individual professors like yourself, or was there some sort of effort within the department, through the dean of instruction or the like, to help facilitate that? Like, how did this come about? Because it does sound like it's happening in more classes, which
it is
surreal to hear about.
It's both. I think it's like a top down and a bottom up. I think individual professors realized like, I can't teach kids if they're totally not doing well emotionally. So it now becomes a part of my job, I guess, to do what I can to enhance or to reduce vulnerabilities. But again, like there was a huge emphasis on it. Like all of our faculty meetings, we have faculty meetings every week. It was about that. It was like, what are some strategies? The TLC, what's it called? The Teaching and Learning Center, or there's like it's TLC, I think it's called, or LTC, one of those two. It's definitely those three letters in some order, and C is at the end. So they have workshops, right, that really help with this and like emphasize. So it's not just theoretical, like, hey, professors, go take care of your students' wellness. For me, that's a little bit easier. I have tools to do that, but I think they like equipped us with like, here's the types of questions, here's the types of ways. They even sent us this really great advising. I remember Phil Zuckerman sent out this email that was like, here's an email that you can send to your students. And his email was probably like, if you would copy paste it into a Word document, I think it was like 12 pages long. It was like so long. And he was like, look, you can copy paste any portion of this. And I did. Like, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like so amazing. Like the amount of thought that I think he was representing a committee. I don't want to give him all the credit. Maybe he did, but he sent this amazing email that really modeled like, these are the types of things that you can say to your students and ask them when you're having your, what's that called? Like registration. So we have like pre-registration where you meet with all your advisees. So he was like, here's the kinds of things that you can be talking about during your meeting. Here's how you can think about the types of questions they might be bringing. So it's not just like top down saying like, hey, care about wellness. It's like, and here's some specific tools and literally specific words that you can copy paste, into your email or into your conversation with your students. So yeah, I would say it's both.
Thank you. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
And are you planning to share your best practices with other colleges? Because that's not happening at my college.
Where do you teach?
I don't teach. I'm an administrator.
Oh, yeah.
In our department with faculty, it's a little bit more difficult to do those things.
Pitzer is really, really unique in that way. Like,
yes.
I mean, think about it. Pitzer is the kind of place that lets me turn in a syllabus with a children's book as the final project. I think a lot of schools would be like, are you freaking kidding me, Marcus? Like, this is college. Like, stop. Like, I would, yeah. But here they're like, oh, that's a great idea, Marcus. Like, yeah, try that. Like, so there's, I think this is a very unique environment that has a really, really high threshold for like what's appropriate. And so you can try stuff. And I feel like Pitzer, and I'm an assistant professor, meaning I don't have tenure yet. And so I think I've received the message from my administrators, and I can't point to exact moments, but the message that I get from them is similar to the message that I'm trying to send my students, which is don't be anxious, like do your job without anxiety, and that's going to actually be the best version of you. And I can only trust that if I see that they're actually willing to like back me up. So if I have, a children's book on my syllabus, they're not going to say one thing, but then actually be like, Marcus, this is shameful. Like we take academics seriously here. Like we're scholars. So I think it makes it easy for me to provide a no shame, no blame, low anxiety, as a source of motivation. It allows me to be creative if I'm not anxious, and I want my students to be creative. And as soon as we're anxious, it's like limbic system is in control instead of like our prefrontal cortex. And so I need my students to be using their prefrontal cortex in class. And I think it's possible because I'm using my prefrontal cortex in class and not just like straight up like lizard brain because I'm anxious and worried about how I'm going to be evaluated by my students or my professors or my colleagues. I feel like my professors sometimes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it would be worth sharing at least, and maybe some faculty will pick it up organically on their own, but it is definitely a difficult thing to do department-wise.
Yeah. It has to be from top down, because I could have like fun ideas, but if the school is going to be punishing of mistakes or not allow that, then like I wouldn't do it. I would just be like, let's just stick to like what's safe, what's the status quo. I'll just lecture at them. But the reality is, like, when I first started doing class the way I was, I did have several students that went to the dean and said, Marcus isn't lecturing enough, right? So they straight up said that. But I'm at a school where the dean told them, like, you know, like, maybe you should schedule a meeting with him and talk about it and figure out what's going on. And they did. And so I said, great, I can lecture more if you want. Like, and I did need to show them that I can lecture, and at the same time, for them to be flexible and say, oh, like, then I guess I kind of also need to adapt to this. And because I think they wanted to see, like, will the dean get mad at Marcus? And the dean was kind of like, Marcus kind of has authority to do whatever he wants in his class. And the students were like, oh, shoot, like, I thought you'd tell him what to do and how to do it. And the dean was like, no, like, I mean, unless he's doing something unethical, right? Like, then yes, like, he'll definitely say, don't do that and maybe fire me. But like, as long as what I'm doing isn't unethical, yeah, he's probably like, you do your thing. And that's a very Pitzer environment.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I think for us as parents, also encouraging our kids pick this particular type of a school over other schools. Definitely.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're a few minutes past 7. Imagine people have New Year's festivities they need to get back to.
Well, thank you. This was truly excellent, and glad it's recorded and it's going to be available to others. So thank you so much for your time and for spending this portion of your day with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so
And
much.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for trusting us with your kids.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Professor Rodriguez, and thank you all for joining us.
Have a good night.
Good night
All
and a
right.
great
Good night,
weekend.
everyone.